today's gratuitous food shot is tempura don. Hi guys, this is part 2 of my series about buying a house here in Eastern Tokyo. Let's pick up where we left off in part 1. So in late 2016, I actually found myself unexpectedly rich. Very sadly, my grandmother passed away, but that meant I inherited the kind of money that would probably serve as a deposit on a house back home or in the States. Added to that, after many delays, the advance for my 3-book deal as a novelist came through. And then there were Bitcoin and Ethereum. You know, I bought Bitcoin on a whim at about $500 and Ethereum at about $10, and both went parabolic. Indeed, it's, a big regret of my life that I didn't put a lot more in back then, and that I discovered leverage and shorted at 17k rather than at 20k, which let's just say resulted in, gains that were a lot smaller than they could have been. But anyway, these sources of cash altogether paid for the house, for my move, and also for the basic things I needed, like furniture, air conditioners, and, a place to stay for a couple of months while we closed out the deal. Like I said before, I was living in Shinjuku back then, and renting an apartment that wasn't really worth the money, despite the great location. At the 2-year mark, in Tokyo you have to pay what's called a renewal fee, which is double rent for the month, just for the privilege of continuing to stay where you were already renting. There's a lot of crap you have to deal with as a renter in Japan, especially in Tokyo, with such joys as key money, which is money paid in gratitude to the landlord, guarantor fees, and deposits that the landlord is just going to take no matter how perfect the apartment is when you leave. At least that was my experience. Not that I have a chip on my shoulder or anything. So back then I already wanted to stay in Japan long term, or at the very least have some kind of base in Japan that I could always return to. But I didn't like the rental situation. And I had more money than I'd ever had before just sitting around, so I decided it made sense to buy. So at first I looked at the online listings in English that are put up by companies who are targeting international buyers. I liked the area I was in, so with help from a company called Beyond Borders, I went to look at the kind of places I could afford without access to a loan around the Shinjuku area. Mostly it was very small apartments and former danshi, which are, I guess, the Japanese equivalent of government subsidized housing, which have no elevators. But still, I was seriously considering some of those. Could have got some good quads from walking up and down from the 5th floor every day. I also did look at foreclosures, but the complications there, like dealing with the former owners who maybe don't want to leave, and depending on their circumstances, you might not want to evict, discovering structural problems because you bought unseen, having to do a huge amount of work to make an abandoned property livable, and just dealing with the complicated auction system without a strong grasp of Japanese.
I don't think I will.
Then I discovered Japanese property portals, especially At Home, which lets you search by area. I found a small house in Nakano that I really liked. It was, basically like a 2-up, 2-down in the UK, but it overlooked a little stream, and it was in an area that I liked. Not quite in Shinjuku, but I could just cycle there. It was cute, it was substantially bigger than the tiny little apartment I was renting at that point, and the agent who had taken me around all the local flats, a friendly Japanese guy who had grown up in Australia, he was happy to arrange a viewing for me. I really liked that house, so I made my first ever property offer, which was promptly rejected. Okay, I made another offer at the full asking price, and again, it was rejected. I got a message back from the agent. Turned out the owners didn't want to sell to a foreigner. Yes, they would rather lose thousands of dollars on the sale than to have to deal with someone born in another part of the world. I've never been closer to giving up on Japan and going home than I was on that day. Which isn't to say that the prejudice I face is in any way comparable to people in much worse situations, but still, it wasn't great. But still, that little house had totally changed my priorities. Why go for a tiny apartment in the neighborhood I knew when I could have a whole house a little further away? If I could get to Shinjuku in a short bike ride, was a train ride so very different? I started to cast a wider net, learning that the properties out east were a lot cheaper. And yes, of course, the ones that are totally out of the greater Tokyo area, they just go for a song. Now certainly I did look at the Minka with big, beautiful, ornate roofs that are out in the middle of nowhere, similar to the one in Ibaraki that Tokyo Llama is renovating. Just look at this lovely beast. And in my eyes, a real bargain at just 13 million yen ready to move into. I could definitely have bought something like that, but well, for me, being in the city was more important, despite the temptation of a gorgeous roof like that. But yeah, I moved to Japan to be in Tokyo. My friends are in Tokyo, band practices and gigs are in Tokyo. The shops and restaurants that I like are in Tokyo. I guess it's mattering a little bit less since the pandemic, because I'm almost exclusively working remotely now, but my jobs are in Tokyo too. So basically, yeah, I wanted to stay in Tokyo. So I started to look for houses here in my budget. They actually aren't that rare in the outskirts, and I went to see a bunch of them. You know, most were very old and ramshackle, needing a lot more work to move into than others did, and not having anywhere else to live affordably for the time it would take to renovate. I needed somewhere that I could move into with only very minimal work, and almost on a whim I decided to go and check a fairly big house that was pushing my budget a little bit but was still affordable. So while I found a weird, dusty, somewhat daunting space when we went to see it, with a taxidermy duck hanging over the genkan to greet us when we stepped inside, the house had a charm that none of the others did. It was huge, at least relatively speaking, and I'd have space for all sorts of things that I'd certainly never be able to have in my teeny tiny apartment. It had a little garden that I could work on, it was close to a station that linked very well to the airport, with another on a main line that ran straight through the centre of Tokyo, only about 15 minutes walk away. The Edo River, the Edogawa, was close by, which is lovely for long walks in the sun and the site of an awesome annual fireworks display. Everywhere I was going for work and things like band practice would be within easy reach. And while it may not have had a sexy roof, that meant I wouldn't regret a DIY solar panel project. It seemed sturdier and more solidly built than others I'd seen. So it went from a backup option that I was checking out essentially on a whim to a house I was actually taking very seriously as an option for buying. In the end, I decided to make a lowball offer that I thought the seller would surely reject. You know, they would probably then suggest a higher price, and I could decide more firmly based on that. Except that isn't what happened. Probably very relieved to get an offer on that big old house their parents had left them, the seller just accepted my first offer. So after 2 years in Japan, with my language skills certainly not as good as I had hoped they would be when I moved here, as indeed they still are not today, I committed to buying a house. And certainly it was a strange process. First, I had to pay a 10% deposit through the agent facilitating this for me. And as is apparently the custom in Japan, this had to be in cold, hard cash. Not a bank transfer, not a secured deposit, certainly not a check. But no, it had to be cash in hand. Now certainly this seemed weird to me, but I got it prepared, even taking time for this silly flex photo. Oh yeah, look at that baller. Then, feeling a bit nervous about it, I took this wad of cash to Shinjuku and I gave it to the agents. Now, assuredly, Japan is a low crime country, but crime does happen. And wouldn't it just be typical if the one day that you got robbed was the one day you were carrying your bloody house deposit money around? My house wasn't even that expensive. You know, I dread to think how many people are buying these multi-million-dollar luxury apartments and they have to carry around the deposits for those. I suppose people like that could just pay for a taxi. I guess I could have just paid for a taxi. Didn't really occur to me. Anyway, after the deposit was made, there was a long wait. Much longer than I wanted it to be, because As I said before, my lease ran out on my apartment and I didn't want to pay the double rent, so in the end I moved into an Airbnb. Luckily, one thing we negotiated was for the majority of my stuff to be moved into the house, which was unoccupied at that time, until the deal was closed. So that was actually super helpful. I actually sneaked here and put some things into the garden shed as well once or twice. The reason we were waiting was that a survey had to be done, and I got a report about things like the previous renovations that had been done and the time that the roof had leaked and needed to be fixed, stuff like that. I also needed to go and get an official registered hankel, which is like a stamp that they use to verify your identity. You dip it on an ink pad and basically it functions the same as a signature does in the West. It doesn't strike me as a very secure system, but then hey, nor is the signature. Anyway, my contact at the agency was great, helping me both go to the local hanko shop and get this made, and then to the city hall in order to register it. And this was definitely an odd little quirk of the process, but I'm sure if need be there can be workarounds, given that plenty of foreigners, especially from China, buy properties here without ever stepping foot in the country, let alone procuring and registering a little wooden shop. I also requested that the large furniture, including a single bed, several big old cupboards, and of course the piano, got left in the house. Which, to be honest, the seller was probably pretty happy to agree to, because clearing that stuff out is expensive. Little did she know that she left her stash of girly manga under the bed. Well, it's mine now, you hear. Oh, mine. I remember the day the deal was closed very clearly. We went to the seller's agent's office and signed the papers transferring ownership to me. They still had to be filed, of course. I couldn't just run off cackling at this point without paying. Once that was done, we all went together to a branch of my bank near Tokyo Station and made the transfer. I had to explain to the bank where the money had come from first, for anti-money laundering purposes, I'm sure, and then I sent it on over to the seller's account. She was a young, shy woman wearing glasses. I didn't confirm it with her, but we were pretty sure that the story was a familiar one in Japan, where her parents passed away and left her the house, but she was quite happy living in a convenient apartment, and she didn't want to go and look after the big old house in the outskirts, so put it on the market. And to be honest, was probably quite pleasantly surprised when she actually got a sale. We transferred fees to the agents, and then I was given various documents and a set of keys, and it was done. A house in Tokyo belonged to me. That was a pretty surreal feeling. And because we were, otherwise homeless, having had an Airbnb booked only until that exact morning, my poor partner was waiting for me in a local Starbucks all day with all of our pets and the bags under the Starbucks bench. We hopped in a taxi to get everything over to the house, which I think is actually the only taxi ride I've ever paid for in Japan. And from then on, well, this was home. So once we had the keys, it was time to settle in. Things like tables and the fridge I got from local recycle stores. And a lot came from Amazon too. It's pretty impressive really how they can deliver a double mattress to your door. And yeah, gradually I've just been filling it all up since then. And I've grown to love it here. But it's time for an update. It's time to stop being embarrassed by the vinyl flooring falling off the walls and the old tired tatami floors. Japanese friends who come to visit tend to agree that it reminds them of their grandma's house, which is, not really the vibe I'm going for. Even if I absolutely do want to preserve the traditional elements, like having one very Japanesey room. And it's also time to do some fun DIY stuff, like adding solar panels, which will probably be my next video. And when I can afford it, in hopefully just a couple of months, it'll be time to start redecorating in earnest. I hope you'll be with me for the journey. If so, well, please do subscribe. That would mean so much to me. For today though, that's all. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys again next time. Goodbye.